We both did
I
that.
was so happy to be done.
You what?
So I was like, ooh, I'm out of here. Might have been Ricky or somebody, but don't you have? I was like, oh. I ran back over, Renee was already 10 minutes into it.
All I know is Luke did it.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Good thing Clovis is like that. Won't be like this today, though.
Let's hope not.
No, gosh, yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
That aren't down.
Okay.
But I haven't received any emails or anything, so.
Good afternoon. I'd like to call the Planning Commission meeting to order. If you would please stand as we have Commissioner Hinkle join us in the flag salute. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And if I can call for the roll. Commissioner Hatcher? Here. Commissioner Hinkle?
Here.
Chair Pro Tem, Bedstead? Here. And for the record, Commissioner Hebert and Chair Antuna are absent. Thank you. And if I can get a motion to approve the Planning Commission meeting minutes for August 22nd.
So move.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Hinkle and a second by Commissioner Hatcher to approve the August 22nd, 2024 minutes. Commissioner Hatcher?
Yes.
Commissioner Hinkle?
Yes.
And Chair Pro Tem Bedstead? Yes. The motion carries 3-0-2. Thank you. Any Commission Secretary comments? We don't have any. Okay. And any Planning Commission member comments? Seeing none. Okay. We'll open the meeting now for public comment. This is an opportunity for any member of the public to address the Planning Commission on any matter that's within the Planning Commission's jurisdiction that is not listed on today's agenda. In order for everyone to be heard, please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. So I'll open that up now for anyone. Okay, seeing none, we'll close the public comments, and we will move into our public hearing. So as was reflected here, there's a protocol that we will follow. We'll walk you through that. Anyone wishing to speak for or against will have 3 minutes to do so. City staff will present. We will go through that. And, first item that we have here is item 2, to consider approval for Resolution 24, GPA 2024, TAC 005. This is a resolution recommending that the City Council consider an addendum to the city's general plan environmental impact report, approve general plan amendment 2024 TAC 005 for the adoption of the City of Clovis sixth cycle housing element, and authorize staff to submit the housing element to the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So at this time, I'll turn it over to our senior planner, Lily.
Thank you, Chair Pro Tem. Good evening, Commissioners. So we are here this evening for two reasons. First of which is to provide you with an overview of the housing element update. And then secondly, as Chair indicated, request that you recommend the City Council approve and adopt the housing element so that we may proceed with submittal to HCD for final certification. So as you all are aware, this endeavor we started since early 2021, and it wasn't until recently, this last July, that we received notice of pre-certification from HCD. So that's great news for us. And now the city will need to adopt the housing element so that we may, again, submit to HCD for final certification. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Chelsea from Ascent Environmental, who is the city's selected consultant for this endeavor.
Okay, it was already on. I turned it off. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Chelsea Payne. I'm the Director of Urban Planning at Ascent, and we're the consultant team that's been helping the city through the process of this housing element update. And if we can pull up the presentation, I can take you through that now. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of what the housing element is. And then I'm going to focus on two main components of the housing element. I'm going to talk about your residential sites inventory, and I'm going to talk about the housing plan. Those are sort of the two components that the city is required to maintain, monitor, and implement as you go forward. So those are really the most important at this point to focus on. I'm going to talk about our process of working with HCD, the State Department of Housing and Community Development, on their review and revisions. And then we'll get to the staff recommendation. So first, an overview of the housing element. As the title of this item indicates, this is a required element of your general plan. At its core, it's the city's plan for how it's going to meet the housing needs of all community members. And it's also about not just meeting current needs, but looking forward over the next 8 years. And it's the city's plan for how it will accommodate its fair share of the regional housing needs. The housing element is on a different trajectory from the other general plan elements. General plans usually look forward about 20 years. The housing element has a very specific 8-year planning timeframe that's set by state law, and a due date that's set by state law as well. The deadline for adopting this housing element was December 31st, 2023. You are not alone in missing that deadline. It was very rare for jurisdictions to actually be able to get through the HCD review process and adopt by the deadline. But we are excited to be at the finish line now and get that done within a year of that deadline. The housing element's the only element of the general plan that is reviewed and certified by the state as being in compliance with state law. And there's a very thick body of law for what has to be addressed in the housing element. This is how your housing element is organized. There are 8 primary chapters. And as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on Chapter 2, the housing plan, which are your goals, policies, and implementation programs. And I'm going to focus on Chapter 5, your sites inventory. But there's a lot of other content here, and if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer any questions about any of these chapters. First, I want to mention that we did a lot of community engagement early on when we kicked off the project back about 2 years ago now. We conducted some virtual focus group meetings and some one-on-one consultations to understand the different perspectives on housing issues in Clovis. We conducted an online survey targeting the broader community, and we held 2 community workshops. The first to initiate the process and hear from the community about their priorities and their ideas for how to address housing needs, and then the second community workshop to present the draft housing element. And then from about that point on, we've been working through the review process with the state. So first on the housing sites inventory, I want to talk about how housing needs are assigned to every city in California. This starts at the state level with the state of California coming up with a regional determination. So they do that for every region of the state. They look at different demographic indicators and population projections, and they assign every region a regional target. Here in the Fresno region, that regional target is about 58,000 housing units. And then the Council of Governments for every region, in this region, that's the Fresno COG, Fresno Council of Governments, or FCOG, what's shown here. The COG is responsible for developing a methodology to distribute that regional housing need to every jurisdiction within the region. And so based on the methodology that was prepared and adopted by Fresno COG, Clovis's share of the regional housing need is 8,977 housing units. And so once every jurisdiction receives their regional housing needs allocation, or their RHNA, they're then responsible for preparing a housing element to show how they can accommodate that RHNA, that housing target, on the land within their jurisdiction. And that housing unit target, or that RHNA, is broken down by various income categories, from very low income and low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. And I know there's a lot of numbers here on the table, but the first column shows your housing target, or your RHNA, from the previous 5th cycle housing element that went from 2015 to 2023, and then that middle column shows the current RHNA for this 6th cycle, 2023 to 2031. You can see that the RHNA this time is quite a bit larger, and that was the case for most jurisdictions across the state of California. And you can also see here how the city of Clovis's RHNA of 8,900 units compares to the city of Fresno, that received a RHNA of about almost 37,000 housing units, and then the county at 2,300. We group together the very low and low income categories into what we call the lower income RHNA. Collectively, your lower income RHNA is 4,475 units. And for most cities in California, that's the hardest to meet. And so there's a lot of attention put on how cities will accommodate their lower income RHNA. And for some context, this table shows, for looking back at 2022 income limits, which is what we have in the housing element, what the upper income limits are for extremely low, very low, low income, for a one-person household, and then a 3-person household. And then what that equates to in terms of what's considered an affordable monthly rent. So if you look at the middle row, a low-income household earning up to 80% of the area median income would be a 3-person household with an annual income of about $56,000, and affordable monthly rent would be about $1,400 a month. And so once we have the city's RHNA, we have to prepare a very detailed inventory of all of the available land where housing can get built. We look at all of the vacant sites, and we also look at non-vacant sites that have some redevelopment potential. And we map all of those sites, and we develop very detailed methodologies for what densities we assume, and we calculate the capacity on all of that land and compare it to your RHNA, your housing target. And the different colors here on the map represent the sites that we've categorized as either meeting your lower, your moderate, or your above moderate income RHNA. And generally, lower income sites are sites that allow at least 30 units per acre. So your higher density multifamily and mixed use zone sites, those get to be counted towards your lower income RHNA if they allow for 30 units per acre. Your moderate income RHNA is generally met on sites, multifamily zone sites that are just below that 30 units per acre, so maybe they allow 25 units per acre. Those are your moderate income sites, generally speaking. And then above moderate income RHNA is met on sites that allow exclusively single family residential. I know the map's a little hard to read, but the lower income sites are shown on the map in sort of that burgundy color, the moderate income sites in purple, above moderate in orange, and then there's also a lot of mixed income sites in brown where we assume that a variety of housing types at a variety of densities would meet all of the income levels. And so what you can generally see is that housing for various income levels is distributed around the city. A lot of it is concentrated in the new growth areas where there's the greatest growth potential over the time frame of the housing element. And then this very detailed table with all these numbers shows this is the summary table of your sites inventory. So your RHNA is at the top, and then we add up all of your capacity on approved projects that are in the pipeline. We looked at capacity on the RHN overlay sites in the various specific plans and master plan areas. We tried to be very transparent in where we're counting what capacity. We do a projection of ADUs or accessory dwelling units, and then we add all of that up, and you can see the total capacity at the bottom. And the city has a surplus capacity for all income levels, which means the city we were able to demonstrate adequate capacity to meet the RHNA at all income levels. And some of this was due to very proactive actions of the city to make land available during this housing element cycle. I'll also say these numbers do represent conservative estimates of capacities, like the actual full build-out capacity in these areas is much greater, but we have to come up with more reasonable assumptions of what could happen during the time frame of the housing element. So I'm going to talk next about the housing plan, which is chapter 2 of your housing element. The housing plan is organized around 3 broad goals that are identified here to accelerate housing production, preserve and improve the existing housing stock, and to affirmatively further fair housing. There are 25 policies and 24 implementation programs organized around these goals. I'm not going to go through each of the programs, but I am going to highlight some of the key programs in each of the goal sections. So under the first goal section, Accelerate Housing Production, there are 12 implementation programs. The programs that have an asterisk next to them are those that came out of the settlement agreement. And so those are all reflected here in the housing element with more details referenced in the settlement agreement, but we've reflected the main components of each of those. So to highlight a few of the programs here, Program H2, your no net loss provisions, state law requires that it's not good enough just to map your sites and your housing element and say, look, we have adequate capacity to meet the RHNA. You actually have to monitor and maintain sufficient capacity during the entire planning period of the housing element. So there's a lot of pressure on planning staff to keep very detailed records of development activity, how it compares to the RHNA, and to make sure that you have sufficient capacity in all income levels for the whole 8 years. So there's that constant monitoring, and if you don't have sufficient capacity, the city would be required to potentially rezone, to create new capacity, maybe find an additional site that wasn't available at the time frame of the housing element, but there is a requirement to replenish the capacity in your site's inventory. Program H4, this is a program to waive or defer up to 50% of your sewer and water fees for up to 120 lower income units per year. And the details of this program are laid out in the settlement agreement. Program H8, this one calls for updating the development code to remove some identified constraints to multifamily housing, and that includes reducing parking standards, reducing some of the open space requirements in your multifamily residential zones, and increasing minimum density in your R3 zone from 15 units per acre up to 20 units per acre. Programs 10, 11, and 12 are also from settlement agreement. The first, program 10 is to set up a local housing trust fund and for the city to make an initial contribution to that fund and to also dedicate to city-owned properties for producing affordable housing. Program H11 is a program to rezone properties to R3 and R4 throughout the city with a goal of creating capacity for about 1,200 additional housing units. And then Program H12, the mixed income ordinance, is a commitment for the city to adopt an ordinance that would require new residential development to set aside between 5 and 10% of units as affordable housing. And I believe the city's already working on the study for implementing that. Under the next goal section, there are 6 implementation programs. The first one, H13, is about preserving your existing lower income housing, specifically those units that are at risk of their subsidy expiring or their deed restriction expiring within the next 10 years. Program H14 is about monitoring and enforcing the existing mobile home rent review and stabilization ordinance, and also expanding outreach to residents and providing a staff liaison or contact for residents. And Program H16 is really about the city continuing its very successful housing rehabilitation programs that provide loans and grants for lower income residents. A lot of this goes to seniors and residents in mobile home parks. And then the last goal section, you see there are a lot of different programs under the goal of affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'll highlight just a few of them. Program H19 is about providing different resources to keep people with special housing needs, particularly extremely low-income residents, which might be seniors or people with disabilities, about helping them get the resources they need to stay in their homes. Programs H22 and H23 are about distributing fair housing information so that people understand what their rights are, particularly tenants to understand what their rights are as tenants, and also conducting some testing for housing discrimination. Program H26, there are several actions in this program to address homelessness, including an objective to support the development of supportive housing, transitional housing, and shelter. And then Program H28 is a pretty long list of amendments to the development code to comply. In most cases, it's to comply with various state laws for special needs housing. So you'll see coming forward as the Planning Commission some code amendments to address emergency homeless shelters, residential care homes, single-room occupancy units. There are a lot of different types of special needs housing that are regulated by state law, and jurisdictions have to update their zoning code to comply. So that's my very quick overview of, I know there are a lot of programs with a lot of details. but those are some of the key programs. Just to talk a little bit about the HCD review process. We were in that phase for quite some time, which is why this slide is so hard to read. But we published the housing element last March in 2023. I mentioned we had a community workshop after that. And then we submitted the housing element to the state, to HCD, for their initial 90-day review. We received our first comment letter from HCD in August of 2023. And that first letter is always the most substantial, that has the most to work through. So after several months, in November, we published a revised draft housing element to address HCD's comments. We resubmitted those revisions to HCD. We got our second comment letter in February of 2024. More revisions submitted in May. And then we got more comments in June. And then through a series of sort of back and forth, we finalized those revisions. And in July, we received essentially a pre-certification letter from the state that says, as currently written, once adopted by the city, we will find your housing element in compliance. That's more or less what it says. It says the contents of this housing element comply with state law. So that's what we are here to present to you tonight, that draft that the state has essentially deemed in compliance. And once it's adopted, we can resubmit, and you can have a certified housing element. Just to give sort of a flavor of the revisions, because we did modify the housing element quite a bit over that time period with all of the back and forth. And generally, a lot of the revisions were to the housing programs. We strengthened a lot of the programs to address fair housing, which was a new requirement for this housing element. So a lot of cities in the state had to, there was a lot of back and forth with HCD on the expectations around fair housing programs. We added a lot of details around specific timing and commitments, and also addressing additional constraints that the state identified in their review. Chapter 4 on the assessment of fair housing, this was a new requirement this round, and so there was a lot of back and forth just wanting more analysis of fair housing issues, and that was true of every jurisdiction in California. So we greatly expanded the analysis of that, and then out of that came some additional commitments in the programs. And the sites inventory changed quite a bit as well. Going through all of our assumptions with a fine-tooth comb, we modified a lot of our assumptions to come to agreement with the state on all of that. So this is a very common, while this is specific to Clovis, it's been a very common process across the state. So next steps, we are tentatively scheduled to go to, or we are scheduled to go to the City Council November 4th. And then following that meeting, if the council adopts the housing element, we can submit it to the state for certification. They technically have 60 days to complete that review, but if nothing changes through the adoption hearing process, we could possibly get that certification sooner. And so that concludes my presentation. I'll leave you here with the recommendation, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Do we have any questions for staff? All right, seeing none, thank you. At this time, I will open the public hearing. We do not have an applicant other than the city itself. At this time, if there is anyone in the audience that would like to speak in support of this project, please step up to the microphone and state your name and address for the record. Seeing none, if there's anyone here who would like to speak in opposition to the project, please step up again and state your name and address. And again, seeing none, I'll bring it back and ask the city if there's anything you would like to add before we bring it to the commission to entertain a motion and discussion.
We have nothing else to add.
you. Okay, so we will close the public hearing at this time and bring it back to the commission. Any discussion?
Yes, on these projects, is there gonna be deed restrictions set on those to keep investors from buying these projects, these houses and stuff, and then making rentals out of them?
So in the housing element, when we map a site and we call it a lower income site, all we're really saying is that that site is zoned at the density that's deemed feasible for lower income housing to get built. So that means it allows for 30 units per acre. But it doesn't mean that there's a restriction on that site to only build as lower income housing. That site could be built with market rate housing. And so we aren't, with this housing element, we aren't only approving lower income housing developments on those sites. We're just saying this, because it's not the city's job to build housing, it's the city's job to zone land at densities where lower income housing could get built. And so I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but we aren't approving specific projects on those sites.
My question is, can the city put in there a deed restriction that will not allow investors to buy these homes, that they're for low income and stuff to buy their first house and things like that? So can the city put these restrictions in there? Because I can see investors coming in and buying these houses up and using them as rentals, and that kind of takes away from what we're trying to do.
So one way to answer that question is that the properties that are identified in the inventory of available sites, we can't feasibly put deed restrictions on those inventory properties. When projects are developed, actually developed on the ground, and they are funded in any way for affordable housing, then they will have deed restrictions on them that require that they be set aside and used only for their intended affordability level, and those are typically 55-year deed restrictions. So maybe the answer is no on undeveloped property, mostly, and yes, when projects are actually developed, they will have deed restrictions.
Yeah, the reason I bring this up is that I see this today, investors buying all of the low income or the low priced housing and making rentals out of them, and they're taking away from what we're trying to do, and it's very difficult. I know, as you know, I'm involved in real estate. I'll make an offer on a house, and some investor will come in and offer $10,000 more for this house. Guess who gets it? So I was concerned about investors coming in and destroying what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Any other questions or discussion? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
I will make a motion to approve GPA 2024-005, a resolution recommending that the City Council consider an addendum to the city's general plan and environmental impact report, approve general plan amendment 2024-005 for the adoption of the City of Clovis sixth cycle housing element, and authorize staff to submit the housing element to the California Department of Housing and Community Development.
I'll second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Hatcher and a second by Commissioner Hinkle to approve General Plan Amendment 2024-005. Commissioner Hatcher?
Yes.
Commissioner Hinkle?
Yes.
Chair Pro Tem Bedstead?
Yes.
Motion passes 302.
Okay, at this time, that is the end of our agenda. I will adjourn the meeting at 4:32.